She was 7 months pregnant, sleeping on a park bench in December, when her own mother called her a disgrace to the family name. The words echoed through the freezing Chicago night like a death sentence, each syllable cutting deeper than the winter wind that whipped through Lincoln Park. Welcome back, and tell me what city you're watching from, or what time it is where you are. Enjoy this story that might just change how you see the world. Emily Rodriguez pressed her swollen hands against her belly, feeling her unborn daughter kick restlessly inside her. At 22, she should have been planning nurseries and baby showers, not rationing the last $3 in her pocket between a gas station sandwich and a night at the shelter, if they had room. The thin jacket she'd grabbed during her hasty escape 3 weeks ago offered little protection against Chicago's brutal December wind, and the park bench's cold metal seemed to leach warmth from her bones with malicious efficiency. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as she watched the city's evening routine unfold around her. Business people in expensive coats hurrying toward warm cars, couples laughing as they headed to dinner dates she could no longer afford to imagine, families walking together with the casual confidence of people who knew they had somewhere safe to sleep tonight. The contrast felt deliberately cruel, as if the universe was showcasing everything she'd lost in one panoramic display of normalcy. The pregnancy had been unplanned, but not unwanted. When she'd first seen those 2 pink lines on the test, sitting in the cramped bathroom of the apartment she'd shared with her boyfriend Marcus, Emily had felt a surge of unexpected joy. She'd always loved children, had spent summers babysitting neighborhood kids who would run to her with scraped knees and hurt feelings, trusting her to make everything better. The idea of having her own child to love and protect had filled her with purpose she'd never experienced before. But Marcus had reacted like she'd announced a terminal diagnosis. "Are you insane?" he'd shouted, pacing their small living room like a caged animal. "I'm 24, Emily. I'm not ready to throw my life away for some accident." The word accident had hit her like a physical blow, reducing their child to an inconvenience, a mistake that required correction rather than celebration. "It doesn't have to change everything," she'd pleaded, following him as he gathered his things with frantic efficiency. "We can make this work. I'll get another job. No," he'd cut her off, shoving clothes into a duffel bag without looking at her. "You can make this work. I'm done." And just like that, the man who'd whispered promises about their future together had walked out, leaving Emily alone with a pregnancy she suddenly couldn't afford and rent she couldn't manage on her waitressing salary alone. The eviction notice had arrived 2 weeks later, printed on official letterhead that made her hands shake as she read the terms of her displacement. 30 days to vacate. But she'd already spent her security deposit on prenatal vitamins and maternity clothes from the thrift store. Her parents' house had seemed like the obvious sanctuary. Surely family would provide the safety net that romantic love had failed to offer. She'd been catastrophically wrong. "You think you can just show up here pregnant and unmarried, expecting us to clean up your mess?" Her father, Carlos, had thundered from his position behind the kitchen table where he'd been reading the evening newspaper. His face had gone red with an anger that seemed disproportionate to her simple request for temporary shelter, as if her pregnancy was a personal insult to his reputation rather than a grandchild who would carry his bloodline. Her mother, Isabel, had stood silently by the stove, stirring soup that would never be offered to her daughter. The woman who had once bandaged Emily's childhood cuts and stayed up all night when fevers made her delirious, now couldn't even make eye contact, as if pregnancy was a contagious shame that might spread through visual contact. "I just need a few months," Emily had whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of winter wind rattling the windows. "Until I can figure something out. Until after the baby comes." "There is no baby," her mother had finally spoken, her voice carrying the flat finality of a court verdict. "Not in this family. Not from you. We raised you better than this, Emily. We gave you values, morals, expectations of decent behavior. And this is how you repay us, by embarrassing us in front of the entire neighborhood." The words had landed with devastating precision, each one calculated to inflict maximum damage on the parts of Emily that still believed family meant unconditional love. She'd stood in the kitchen where she'd helped prepare countless holiday meals, where she'd done homework at the counter while her mother cooked dinner, where she'd announced her high school graduation and her first job, and realized that all of those memories had been conditional on her maintaining their approval. "Please," she'd tried one last time, her hands instinctively protective around her belly. "I'll sleep in the basement. I'll pay rent as soon as I can work again." Halskui, you'll leave, her father had interrupted, standing up with the authority that had terrified her as a child, but now just seemed pathetic and small. Tonight. And you won't come back until you've fixed this mistake. We won't have neighbors gossiping about our daughter's poor choices. We won't have people questioning how we raised you. That had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of sleeping in her car until it was repossessed. 3 weeks of rotating between shelters that never had enough beds. 3 weeks of watching her savings dwindle to nothing while her body demanded nutrition she couldn't afford to provide. The baby inside her had grown stronger while Emily had grown weaker, a cruel irony that reminded her daily that pregnancy required resources she no longer possessed. Tonight, Lincoln Park's bench had become her temporary refuge because the shelter was full, and the warming centers had closed at 6. The park felt safer than the streets, surrounded by apartment buildings where people might notice if someone tried to hurt her, close enough to the hospital that she could walk there if labor started unexpectedly. But safety was relative when you were 7 months pregnant and sleeping outdoors in December, when every movement required careful calculation to avoid triggering premature contractions. She shifted position, trying to find an angle that relieved the pressure on her lower back, when a pair of headlights swept across the park and came to a stop. Emily tensed, preparing to move if necessary. Police sometimes cleared homeless people from public spaces, and she'd learned that explaining her circumstances often made officers more suspicious rather than sympathetic. But the car that had stopped wasn't a police cruiser. It was a black BMW, sleek and expensive, the kind of vehicle driven by people who lived in the high-rise apartments overlooking the park. The engine idled quietly, while someone inside seemed to be observing her, probably deciding whether she represented a threat to neighborhood property values that required management. Emily pulled her jacket tighter and looked away, hoping whoever it was would simply drive past and leave her alone. She'd endured enough judgment for one lifetime, absorbed enough disapproval to last several generations. All she wanted was to rest for a few hours before moving on to whatever temporary sanctuary tomorrow might offer. Instead, she heard a car door close and footsteps approaching across the frozen grass. A man's voice, carefully neutral, spoke from a respectful distance. "Excuse me, miss. Are you all right?" Emily's body went rigid at the sound of the voice, every muscle tensing with the learned wariness of someone who'd discovered that kindness often came with hidden costs. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, studying the pattern of fallen leaves that had frozen into the concrete like nature's own mosaic, avoiding eye contact that might encourage conversation she wasn't prepared to handle. "I'm fine," she whispered, the lie so automatic it required no thought. She'd been practicing variations of that response for weeks, perfecting the tone that suggested she was merely resting rather than slowly dying of exposure and neglect. The words felt hollow even to her own ears, but they'd become her shield against well-meaning strangers who might ask questions she couldn't answer without crying. The man didn't immediately leave, which surprised her. Most people accepted the polite fiction and moved on, relieved to have their civic duty satisfied without requiring actual involvement in someone else's crisis. But these footsteps remained planted on the frozen ground, close enough that she could see expensive leather shoes that probably cost more than she'd earned in her last month of work. "It's just that it's below freezing tonight," the voice continued, and something in its tone made Emily risk a glance upward. The man standing a respectful distance away was older than she'd expected, maybe 40, with dark hair showing early touches of grey, and wearing a wool coat that looked professionally tailored. But his eyes held something she hadn't seen directed at her in months, genuine concern without judgment. "And you're pregnant," he added gently, as if she might not have noticed her condition. "I'm sorry for bothering you, but I couldn't drive past without making sure you were okay." Emily's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. When was the last time someone had apologized for bothering her? When had anyone last treated her presence as something deserving of respect rather than an inconvenience to be managed or ignored? The simple courtesy of his approach felt foreign after weeks of being treated like a problem to be solved or a moral failing to be corrected. She'd once been the kind of person who attracted kindness naturally. Before Marcus, before the pregnancy, before her family's rejection, Emily had been known for her warmth and generosity, the friend people called when they needed emotional support or practical help. She'd spent her teenage years volunteering at the local community center, reading to children whose parents worked double shifts, helping elderly neighbors with grocery shopping, organizing clothing drives for families who'd lost everything in house fires. Her mother had often complained about Emily's tendency to give too much of herself to others. "You can't save everyone, Mija," Isabel would say, while Emily packed care packages for homeless individuals she'd encountered downtown. "People need to learn to take care of themselves. You're going to exhaust yourself trying to fix problems that aren't yours to solve." But Emily had believed that kindness was never wasted, that small acts of compassion created ripples that eventually reached shores you'd never see. She'd carried that philosophy through high school, through her first job at a diner, where she'd regularly bought meals for customers who couldn't afford them, through the early days of her relationship with Marcus, when she'd believed their love could overcome any obstacle. How naive that seemed now, sitting on a park bench in December with nowhere to go and no one to call. Her history of generosity had earned her exactly nothing when she'd needed support in return. The community center had expressed sympathy when she'd explained why she could no longer volunteer, but they'd offered no practical assistance. The elderly neighbors she'd helped for years had suddenly become unavailable when she'd knocked on their doors asking for temporary shelter. Even her closest friends had disappeared, their phone numbers mysteriously disconnected, or their social media accounts blocking her attempts at contact. Marcus had been particularly cruel in his dismissal, treating her pregnancy like a deliberate trap she'd set to ruin his carefully planned future. "You always said you wanted to help people," he'd sneered during their final argument, throwing her volunteer work back at her like evidence of character defects. "Well, now you can help yourself. See how that works out for you." The worst part had been discovering how quickly people's perception of her changed once her circumstances shifted. The same co-workers who'd praised her work ethic and reliability had started treating her with barely concealed disdain once her pregnancy became visible. The manager at the diner where she'd worked for 2 years had suddenly found reasons to criticize her performance, cutting her hours until she'd been forced to quit rather than face the daily humiliation of being treated like a burden. "You're moving too slowly," he'd complained during her last week, watching her navigate between tables with the careful balance required by her expanding belly. "Customers are complaining about the service. Maybe you should consider whether this job is still appropriate for your condition." The emphasis he'd placed on that final word had made it clear that her pregnancy was seen as a professional liability rather than a natural biological process that millions of women navigated while continuing to work. She'd wanted to remind him of the countless double shifts she'd covered when other employees called in sick, the holiday schedules she'd worked so parents could spend time with their children, the difficult customers she'd handled with grace when others had refused to deal with them. Instead, she'd untied her apron and placed it on the counter, walking out with what little dignity she could maintain while fighting back tears that would have only confirmed their assessment of her as overly emotional and unprofessional. Now, looking up at this stranger who'd stopped his expensive car to check on her welfare, Emily felt the weight of all those accumulated rejections pressing against her chest like a physical force. Every person who'd crossed the street to avoid making eye contact, every former friend who'd suddenly become too busy to return phone calls, every family member who'd chosen reputation over relationship, they'd all contributed to this moment, when simple human kindness felt shocking rather than normal. "My name is James," the man said, crouching down so they were closer to eye level, a gesture that immediately made the conversation feel less intimidating. "James Walker. I live a few blocks from here, and I noticed you've been in the park for a while. I don't want to intrude, but it's going to get much colder tonight. Do you have somewhere warm to go?" Emily stared at him, searching his face for signs of the ulterior motives she'd learned to expect from men who offered help to vulnerable women. But James Walker's expression remained open and concerned, without the calculating look that usually preceded requests for favors or services she wasn't willing to provide. "I'm waiting for someone," she lied, the words coming automatically even though she knew they sounded unconvincing. She'd been alone for so long that the concept of having someone to wait for felt like speaking a foreign language she'd forgotten how to conjugate properly. James nodded as if he believed her, but something in his expression suggested he understood the protective fiction she was maintaining. "That's good," he said softly. "I just wanted to make sure. Sometimes people get stuck without good options, and I know how dangerous it can be to spend a night outside in this weather." The phrase "stuck without good options" hit Emily with unexpected accuracy, describing her situation with more precision than any of the clinical terms social workers had used during her brief encounters with the assistance system. She wasn't homeless by choice or due to addiction or mental illness. She was stuck, trapped between circumstances she couldn't control and resources she couldn't access. "I used to think there were always good options," she found herself saying, surprising herself with the admission. "I thought if you worked hard and treated people kindly, things would work out somehow, that someone would help when you really needed it." James was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested personal experience with disappointment. "Sometimes the people who should help are the ones who hurt us most. And sometimes help comes from places we never expected." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card, extending it toward her with careful movements that wouldn't startle someone who'd learned to flinch at sudden gestures. "I'm not trying to pressure you or make you uncomfortable, but I have a guest house behind my home that's currently empty. It has heat, a bathroom, a small kitchen. If you change your mind about having somewhere warm to spend the night, the address is on there." Emily took the card with trembling fingers, reading the embossed text that identified James Walker as CEO of Walker Development Group. The address was in Lincoln Park's most expensive neighborhood, where lakefront properties sold for millions and residents hired security services to protect their privacy. "Why?" she asked, the word barely audible above the wind that was picking up as evening deepened into night. James stood slowly, his knees creaking in a way that suggested he wasn't as young as he'd first appeared. "Because everyone deserves basic dignity," he said simply. "And because being pregnant and alone in winter isn't something anyone should have to endure." He walked back toward his car, then paused and turned around. "There's no obligation," he called across the distance. "No expectations, just warmth and safety if you decide you want it." Emily watched the BMW's taillights disappear into traffic, clutching the business card like a lifeline she wasn't sure she could trust. In her experience, wealthy men didn't offer shelter to homeless pregnant women without expecting something in return. But James Walker's demeanor had felt different. Careful rather than predatory, respectful rather than entitled. As the temperature continued to drop and her baby's movements became more urgent, Emily found herself reading the address on the card again and again, wondering if desperation had finally reached the point where she had to choose between pride and survival. 2 hours later, when the winter wind had become a living thing that clawed through her inadequate jacket and her baby's kicks had grown frantic with cold, Emily found herself standing at the address on James Walker's business card. The house was everything she'd expected from Lincoln Park's elite neighborhood, a 3-story Victorian mansion with perfectly maintained stonework and windows that glowed with warm yellow light, suggesting the kind of domestic comfort she'd almost forgotten existed. The guest house sat behind the main property, connected by a pathway lined with small lights that created a fairy tale atmosphere completely at odds with Emily's grim circumstances. When James answered her tentative knock, his face showed genuine relief rather than the satisfaction of someone whose charity case had finally accepted defeat. "I'm glad you came," he said simply, stepping aside to let her enter a space that felt impossibly luxurious after weeks of shelters and park benches. The small apartment was furnished with care: comfortable chairs, a kitchenette stocked with basic groceries, a bathroom with fluffy towels that looked like they'd never been used for anything more demanding than gentle face drying. "The heat works," James explained, adjusting a thermostat that responded immediately with a gentle hum of warm air. "There are clean sheets on the bed, and I put some food in the refrigerator. Nothing fancy, just basics. Please make yourself at home." Emily stood in the center of the room, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of clean surfaces and controlled temperature. When had basic shelter become such an extraordinary gift? When had she started measuring wealth by access to hot water and privacy? "I can't pay you," she whispered, the admissions scraping her throat raw. "Not right now, maybe not for months." James waved away her concern with a gesture that suggested money was irrelevant to his decision. "There's no rent, no payment expected. Just rest and take care of yourself." He paused at the door, then added, "If you need anything, the main house is right there. Don't hesitate to ask." That first night, Emily slept more deeply than she had in weeks, her body finally able to relax in warmth and safety. The bed was soft without being extravagant. The sheets smelled like lavender fabric softener, and for the first time since Marcus had abandoned her, she allowed herself to imagine that maybe things could improve. James proved to be exactly as kind as his initial gesture had suggested. Over the following days, he checked on her welfare without being intrusive, brought groceries without making her feel like a charity case, and even arranged for a local doctor to provide prenatal care when Emily confessed she hadn't been able to afford medical attention in weeks. Dr. Martinez has been our family physician for years, James explained when he drove her to the appointment. She's discreet, professional, and she's donated time to women's clinics throughout the city. She understands difficult circumstances. Dr. Martinez confirmed that despite Emily's recent hardships, the baby was developing normally and showed no signs of distress from her mother's nutritional struggles. You've been taking good care of yourself under impossible circumstances, the doctor said with professional warmth. But now that you have stable housing, we need to focus on building up your strength for delivery. For 3 weeks, Emily existed in a bubble of safety that felt almost too good to be true. She helped James with small administrative tasks, organizing his home office, managing correspondence, coordinating service appointments, work that made her feel useful rather than pitied. He paid her fairly for these simple tasks, more than she'd earned at the diner, money that allowed her to buy maternity clothes that actually fit and nutritious food that her body craved. But the bubble shattered on a Tuesday morning when Emily answered the guest house door to find a woman in her 50s standing on the pathway, dressed in designer clothes and radiating the particular brand of cold fury that only comes from discovering unwelcome surprises in your perfectly ordered world. "So you're the little project my husband has been hiding," the woman said, her voice carrying the sharp precision of someone accustomed to cutting through problems with surgical efficiency. "I'm Catherine Walker, and I think it's time we had a conversation." Emily's stomach dropped as understanding crashed over her like ice water. James was married. The kind, generous man who'd rescued her from freezing to death was someone's husband, and that someone was standing before her with eyes that could freeze hellfire. "Mrs. Walker, Emily began, but Catherine held up a manicured hand that commanded immediate silence. "Please don't embarrass us both by pretending this is something innocent," Catherine continued, stepping into the guest house without invitation and surveying the space with the calculating gaze of someone conducting a hostile inventory. "Do you really think I don't know what this is? A pregnant girl living in our guest house being supported by my husband's money?" "It's not like that," Emily protested, her voice barely above a whisper. "James was just helping me because I had nowhere else to go. He's been nothing but respectful." "Respectful," Catherine repeated, the word dripping with sarcasm. "How wonderfully noble of him. And what exactly do you think happens next in this little fairy tale? He divorces me and plays house with you and your bastard child." The crude phrase hit Emily like a physical slap, reducing her unborn daughter to something shameful and illegitimate rather than the miracle she'd come to represent. She pressed her hands protectively against her belly, feeling the baby respond to her mother's distress with agitated movements. "I never asked for anything beyond shelter," Emily said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "James offered help when I was sleeping in the park. That's all this is." Catherine moved closer, her expensive perfume creating a cloud of aggressive femininity that made the small space feel even more suffocating. "Let me explain something about my husband, dear. James has what you might call a savior complex. He finds broken things, businesses, buildings, people, and he fixes them. It makes him feel important, valuable, needed." She paused dramatically, allowing her words to sink in before delivering the killing blow. "But once something is fixed, once it's no longer broken and desperate, James loses interest very quickly. He moves on to the next project, the next damsel in distress who makes him feel like a hero." Emily felt something cold and heavy settling in her chest, as Catherine's words painted a picture of manipulation disguised as kindness. Had James's gentleness been calculated rather than genuine? Had his respectful distance been strategic rather than ethical? "You think you're special," Catherine continued, examining her fingernails with theatrical boredom. "You think you found some kind of knight in shining armor who's going to solve all your problems and give you the life you feel you deserve. But you're just the latest in a long line of strays he's brought home over the years." "That's not true," Emily whispered, but her conviction was already crumbling under the weight of Catherine's confident assertions. "Oh, but it is. There was the young man whose family had been evicted. James housed him for months until he got back on his feet, then never spoke to him again. The elderly woman who lost her apartment in a fire, James paid for her temporary housing until she found something permanent, then moved on to the next crisis that needed his attention." Catherine's voice took on a tone of mock sympathy that was somehow more cruel than outright hostility. "Don't you see, darling? You're not a person to him. You're a problem to be solved, a good deed to be completed so he can feel better about his privileged life. And once you're no longer desperate, Once you're just another single mother trying to make ends meet, he'll find someone new who needs saving. The words landed with devastating accuracy because they explained so much about James's behavior that Emily had found puzzling. His careful distance, his emphasis on temporary help, his insistence that she not feel obligated or indebted, all of it suddenly seemed like the practiced routine of someone who'd done this before, who'd learned to manage the expectations of people he rescued to avoid messy emotional complications. "I want you gone by tomorrow," Catherine said, her tone shifting back to business-like efficiency. "Pack whatever James bought you, consider it severance pay for services rendered. But understand that this little arrangement is over. My husband may enjoy playing savior, but I won't allow him to install his latest charity case in our property indefinitely." Emily stood frozen as Catherine walked toward the door, then paused for one final humiliation. "Oh, and dear, when you inevitably run into James around the neighborhood, and you will, because he'll want to check on his former project, don't expect the same warmth you've been receiving. Once James has moved on, he becomes remarkably good at not seeing people he used to help. It's quite a talent, really." The door closed behind Catherine with a soft click that somehow sounded more final than any slam could have managed. Emily sank into the chair where she'd spent peaceful evenings reading library books and imagining a future that included stability and safety for her daughter. Now those imaginings felt like the cruelest kind of self-deception. She'd allowed herself to believe that kindness could exist without ulterior motives, that her circumstances had finally taken a turn towards something sustainable. Instead, she'd been nothing more than a temporary entertainment for a wealthy man who collected broken people the way others collected art or vintage wines. The baby kicked urgently, as if sensing her mother's emotional distress, and Emily realized with growing horror that she was back where she'd started, alone, pregnant, and homeless. But now with the additional burden of having believed, however briefly, that someone actually cared about her welfare rather than simply enjoying the feeling of being needed by someone desperate enough to be grateful for scraps of basic human decency. Tomorrow she would be back on the streets, but this time with the bitter knowledge that even genuine-seeming kindness could be nothing more than elaborate performance art designed to make privileged people feel better about themselves while changing nothing meaningful for the people they claimed to help. She sat in the warm guest house for the last time, surrounded by comfort that had always been temporary, wondering how she'd been naive enough to mistake pity for compassion, charity for genuine care. Emily spent that final night in the guest house, staring at the ceiling, listening to the central heating system cycle on and off with mechanical regularity, each comfortable sound a reminder of the warmth she'd be losing at sunrise. She'd packed her few belongings into the same plastic bag she'd carried when James first found her, the pathetic collection of thrift store maternity clothes and borrowed toiletries, serving as evidence of how little progress she'd actually made, despite 3 weeks of feeling safe. At precisely 8 in the morning, James knocked softly on the door. When Emily opened it, his face showed a careful blankness that confirmed everything Catherine had said about his ability to emotionally disconnect from his former projects. "Catherine told me she spoke with you yesterday," he said, his voice carrying the polite distance of someone addressing a stranger rather than a woman he'd rescued from freezing to death. "I want you to know that I'm sorry things have to end this way." Emily searched his expression for any sign of the warmth that had made her feel human again over the past weeks, but found only the practiced sympathy of someone performing a distasteful but necessary task. "So it's true then, what she said about me being just another project?" James shifted uncomfortably, his expensive shoes making small sounds against the pathway's decorative stones. "I think Catherine may have been harsh in her explanation, but she's right that this arrangement was always meant to be temporary. I hope you understand." The phrase, "I hope you understand," landed like a dismissal wrapped in false courtesy, the kind of language designed to make the speaker feel better about abandoning someone while placing the burden of acceptance on the person being abandoned. Emily recognized it as the same tone her parents had used when explaining why family reputation mattered more than family loyalty. "What I understand," Emily said quietly, "is that wealthy people like to feel good about helping, but only when it's convenient, only when it doesn't complicate their real lives." James's jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. "That's not fair, Emily. I provided you with shelter when you needed it most. I'm not obligated to treat me like a human being rather than a temporary hobby?" Emily interrupted, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "You're right. You're not obligated to anything. Thank you for reminding me." She walked past him toward the street, leaving him standing in his perfectly maintained garden with his conscience and his comfortable rationalizations. But the small victory of having the last word felt hollow when her immediate future consisted of pregnancy, winter, and nowhere to go. The shelter system that had failed her before was even less accessible now that her condition had progressed to 8 months. The larger facilities claimed their beds were full, while the smaller ones cited insurance concerns about accommodating women so close to delivery. Emily found herself cycling through a series of temporary options. A different park bench each night, the waiting room of a 24-hour laundromat when security guards weren't paying attention, the bathroom of a gas station where the overnight clerk had taken pity on her obvious desperation. 3 days after leaving James's guest house, Emily's situation attracted the attention of a social worker named Rebecca Chen, who approached her while she was sitting outside a public library, trying to stay warm in the winter sunshine, while reading pregnancy books she couldn't afford to buy. "Excuse me," Rebecca said, settling onto the bench beside Emily with the practiced casualness of someone trained to approach vulnerable populations without causing alarm. "I'm Rebecca Chen from the Department of Social Services. I've received some reports about a pregnant woman who might need assistance." Emily's first instinct was to deny needing help, but exhaustion had worn down her pride to the point where survival mattered more than dignity. "I'm Emily Rodriguez. I guess I'm who you're looking for." Rebecca was a small woman in her 30s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of human desperation without becoming cynical about her ability to help. She listened to Emily's story with professional attention, taking notes that would become part of a case file designed to reduce complex human suffering into manageable administrative categories. "Your situation is challenging," Rebecca said when Emily finished explaining how pregnancy had transformed her from working citizen to homeless burden in the span of a few months. "But there are options. The state has emergency housing programs for pregnant women, and there are federal programs that provide assistance with food and medical care." For the first time in days, Emily felt a flutter of hope. Maybe there was a safety net after all, official support systems designed to catch people who fell through the cracks of family and personal relationships. But as Rebecca explained the various programs and their requirements, Emily's hope began to erode like sugar in rain. Emergency housing had a waiting list that stretched for months, with priority given to women who could prove domestic violence or substance abuse, conditions that apparently ranked higher than simple abandonment and economic desperation. Food assistance required an address for mail delivery, creating a bureaucratic catch-22 for people whose primary problem was lack of a permanent address. "So there is one immediate option," Rebecca said, consulting her notes with the careful attention of someone navigating a minefield of regulations and limited resources. "The state's emergency intervention program can place you in temporary housing within 48 hours, but it requires you to participate in mandatory counseling sessions designed to address the underlying issues that led to your current circumstances." Emily stared at her, the implications of that requirement sinking in like poison. "Underlying issues? You mean like being abandoned by my boyfriend and disowned by my family?" Rebecca's expression showed the patient sympathy of someone who'd delivered this explanation countless times before. "The program is designed to help participants develop better decision-making skills and support networks to prevent future crises. The counseling component addresses patterns of behavior that may have contributed to your current situation." The phrase "patterns of behavior" hit Emily like a slap. Here was another professional suggesting that her circumstances resulted from personal failings rather than the calculated cruelty of people she'd trusted. According to the state's logic, being pregnant and homeless was evidence of poor judgment that required correction through therapeutic intervention. "So I'm supposed to attend counseling sessions where someone explains how I'm responsible for being abandoned?" Emily asked, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "How my choices led to sleeping in parks while 8 months pregnant. The program has helped many women develop the skills they need to build stable, independent lives," Rebecca replied, her tone carrying the defensive edge of someone who'd had this argument before. "Participation shows commitment to positive change, which makes participants eligible for additional services and support." Emily realized she was trapped in a system that required her to accept blame for her victimization as the price of receiving help. She could access shelter and assistance, but only by agreeing that her pregnancy out of wedlock and subsequent abandonment represented moral failures that required professional correction. "What if I refuse the counseling?" Emily asked. "Then you remain ineligible for emergency housing assistance," Rebecca said simply. "The program requires full participation to ensure that resources are used effectively and that participants gain maximum benefit from the intervention." Emily sat in silence, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her as if sensing her mother's distress. Around them, people walked past carrying coffee cups and shopping bags, living normal lives that included the assumption of shelter and safety that Emily had lost the right to take for granted. "I need to think about it," Emily said finally. Rebecca handed her a business card and a pamphlet that featured photos of smiling women who'd apparently been successfully rehabilitated by the state's programs. "Don't wait too long to decide. Winter weather makes outdoor living particularly dangerous for pregnant women, and the program has limited spaces available." As Rebecca walked away, Emily stared at the pamphlet with its cheerful testimonials from program graduates who'd learned to take responsibility for their circumstances and build better lives through professional guidance. The women in the photos looked grateful and compliant, exactly the kind of success stories that justified funding for programs designed to fix broken people rather than addressing the systems that broke them in the first place. That evening, sitting in the library until closing time while trying to delay her return to another cold night in another temporary hiding place, Emily encountered the final insult to her remaining dignity. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Catherine Walker. I heard you're still in the neighborhood. James wanted me to remind you that there are shelters and services available for people in your situation. We hope you'll take advantage of the help that's offered." The message was a masterpiece of false concern wrapped in veiled threat. Catherine was making it clear that Emily's continued presence in Lincoln Park was being monitored, and that she was expected to accept whatever inadequate assistance the system provided, rather than remaining visible as a reminder of the Walkers' temporary charity. Emily deleted the message without responding, but its implications lingered like a bad taste. Even in her lowest moments, people with power over her circumstances felt compelled to maintain the fiction that adequate help was available for those wise enough to accept it. The subtext was clear. If she remained homeless and desperate, it was because she was too proud or too stupid to utilize the resources that compassionate society had provided. As the library's closing announcement echoed through the building, and Emily gathered her plastic bag of possessions for another night of searching for somewhere safe to rest, she understood with crystalline clarity that she'd been abandoned not just by individuals, but by entire systems designed to help people like her, while ensuring they understood their position in society's hierarchy. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, a reminder that time was running out for both of them, and that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford when survival required accepting help that came with conditions designed to humiliate rather than heal. The contractions started during Emily's third night back on the streets, sharp pains that gripped her lower back and radiated through her swollen belly with increasing intensity. She was huddled in the doorway of a closed bookstore, wrapped in a donated blanket that smelled of industrial disinfectant and other people's desperation, when the first wave hit with enough force to make her gasp audibly. It was too early. At 34 weeks, her daughter wasn't ready for the world that waited outside Emily's body, a world of winter cold and uncertain shelter, of bureaucratic indifference and conditional charity. But stress and malnutrition had apparently convinced Emily's body that pregnancy was a luxury it could no longer sustain, triggering labor that felt like her own biology joining the conspiracy against her survival. Emily tried to breathe through the pain the way she'd read about in the library books she could no longer access, focusing on slow inhalation and controlled exhalation, while her body prepared to expel a baby into circumstances that made successful delivery seem like a cruel joke. Between contractions, she attempted to flag down passing cars, hoping someone would show enough compassion to drive a pregnant woman in labor to the hospital, rather than assuming she was just another homeless person demanding attention. Car after car passed without stopping. Drivers glanced at her briefly before looking away, their faces showing the careful neutrality of people who'd learned to ignore human suffering in order to protect their own emotional equilibrium. Some slowed down slightly, as if considering whether her situation warranted involvement, then accelerated away when they remembered that helping strangers often created complications that stable people couldn't afford to accept. Finally, a taxi pulled over, but when the driver saw Emily's condition and obvious poverty, his expression shifted from professional courtesy to active hostility. "I'm not running a charity service," he said before she could even speak. "This cab isn't equipped for medical emergencies, and I'm not responsible if something happens to you or your baby. Please," Emily managed between contractions that were coming closer together with alarming regularity. "I just need to get to the hospital. I have some money." "How much money?" the driver interrupted, his tone suggesting that Emily's financial resources would determine whether her medical emergency qualified for his attention. Emily fumbled in her pocket for the crumpled bills she'd been saving for food, counting out $17 with shaking hands. "It's all I have. Please, my baby's coming early." The driver looked at the money with obvious disgust, as if Emily's poverty was a personal insult to his professional dignity. $17 won't even cover the fare to the hospital, let alone cleaning fees if you have that baby in my cab. Find someone else to solve your problems." He drove away, leaving Emily doubled over in pain on the sidewalk, while labor progressed with the relentless momentum of biology that didn't care about her circumstances or her ability to pay for appropriate medical care. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was experiencing the most natural process in human existence while being treated as if pregnancy was a personal failure that required others to sacrifice their comfort for her benefit. Emily began walking toward the hospital, stopping every few minutes when contractions forced her to lean against whatever support she could find. Mailboxes, fire hydrants, the brick walls of buildings whose owners had probably never imagined their architecture serving as emergency labor support for desperate women. Each step felt like a victory against circumstances designed to defeat her, but the distance seemed to expand rather than contract, as her body's urgent signals indicated that her daughter had decided not to wait for convenient timing or appropriate setting. 2 blocks from the hospital, when contractions were less than 5 minutes apart and Emily could feel her baby moving lower with each wave of pain, she encountered her final humiliation. A security guard from one of the upscale apartment buildings approached her with the aggressive authority of someone whose job was protecting wealthy residents from exactly the kind of human crisis Emily represented. "Ma'am, you can't loiter in this area," he said, his hand resting on the radio that connected him to backup resources Emily couldn't access. "This is private property, and residents have complained about homeless individuals making them feel unsafe." Emily stared at him through the haze of pain and exhaustion, wondering what kind of training taught someone to view a woman in active labor as a security threat, rather than a human being requiring immediate assistance. "I'm not loitering," she said, her voice strained with the effort of speaking during a contraction. "I'm in labor. My baby is coming and I'm trying to get to the hospital." The guard's expression didn't soften. If anything, he seemed more determined to remove her from his jurisdiction before her medical emergency became his legal responsibility. "There are protocols for medical situations. You need to call an ambulance or find appropriate transportation. This sidewalk isn't an appropriate place for medical events." "I tried calling for help," Emily explained, fighting to remain standing as another contraction gripped her with increasing intensity. "No one will help me. I just need to get to the hospital 2 blocks away." "That's not my problem," the guard replied with the practiced indifference of someone who'd been trained to prioritize property values over human welfare. "I'm required to maintain order in this area, and your presence is creating a disturbance. Move along or I'll have to call the police." Emily realized with devastating clarity that even in the most vulnerable moment of her life, when she was literally bringing new life into the world, she was seen primarily as a problem to be managed, rather than a person deserving basic human consideration. The security guard was more concerned about maintaining the aesthetic comfort of wealthy residents than ensuring a woman in labor reached medical care safely. "My water just broke," Emily whispered, feeling warm fluid running down her legs as her body prepared for delivery, whether or not she reached appropriate medical facilities. "Please, I'm not trying to cause problems. I just need help." The guard took a step back, his face showing disgust rather than concern. "You definitely can't stay here now. This is a health hazard. I'm calling the police and paramedics to handle this situation." He spoke into his radio with the efficiency of someone reporting a spill that required cleanup, rather than a human being in medical crisis. Emily heard him describe her as a homeless individual creating a sanitary issue rather than a woman about to give birth, reducing her labor to a maintenance problem that threatened neighborhood cleanliness. As sirens approached in the distance, Emily felt another contraction that seemed to tear through her entire body with an intensity that made previous pain feel like gentle preparation. Her baby was coming whether anyone helped or not, whether she was surrounded by medical professionals or security guards who viewed her emergency as an inconvenience to be resolved as quickly as possible. She leaned against a brick wall that offered no comfort, but at least provided stability, while her body completed the process of bringing her daughter into a world that had already made clear its hostility toward both of them. The approaching sirens sounded like cavalry, arriving too late to prevent disaster. Emergency responders summoned not to help, but to contain a situation that threatened the comfort of people who mattered more than she did. The paramedics who arrived were professional, but clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of delivering a baby on a sidewalk, while coordinating with police officers who seemed more concerned about traffic disruption than medical emergency. Emily found herself surrounded by uniformed personnel who treated her labor as a logistical challenge rather than the profound moment she'd imagined when she first learned she was pregnant. "Ma'am, we're going to get you to the hospital as quickly as possible," one paramedic said, but his tone suggested he was following protocols rather than responding to her individual needs. "Try to delay delivery until we can get you to appropriate facilities." Emily wanted to laugh at the suggestion that she could simply postpone labor to accommodate everyone else's convenience, but another contraction silenced her with pain that felt like her body was being torn apart from the inside. Her daughter was determined to be born on this sidewalk, surrounded by strangers who viewed her arrival as an administrative complication rather than the miracle Emily had been anticipating for months. As the paramedics prepared to transport her, Emily caught sight of James Walker standing in the crowd of onlookers who had gathered to witness her public degradation. His face showed carefully controlled concern, the expression of someone who recognized a former charity case but felt no obligation to become involved in her ongoing crisis. Their eyes met for a moment across the chaos of emergency vehicles and official personnel, and Emily saw in his expression the confirmation of everything Catherine had said about his ability to disconnect from people once their usefulness as good deeds had expired. He was watching her give birth on a sidewalk with the detached interest of someone observing a traffic accident, concerned enough to look but not enough to help. In that moment, as her body pushed her daughter toward a world that had already proven itself hostile to their existence, Emily felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not the physical changes of labor, but an emotional transformation that felt like armor forming around her heart. She was done begging for help from people who viewed her desperation as entertainment, done accepting crumbs of assistance that came with conditions designed to humiliate rather than heal. Her daughter would be born into poverty and uncertainty, but she would also be born to a mother who had finally stopped apologizing for existing, who had learned that dignity wasn't something others could grant or revoke, but something she could claim for herself, regardless of her circumstances. As the ambulance doors closed, and Emily felt her baby beginning to crown, she made a silent promise to the daughter who was about to meet the world. They would survive this together, and they would never again mistake pity for love or charity for genuine care. The last thing she saw before pain consumed her completely was the crowd of well-dressed onlookers dispersing back to their comfortable lives, already forgetting the homeless woman who'd had the audacity to give birth in their neighborhood, as if human biology cared about property values and social appropriateness. Grace Elena Rodriguez entered the world at 3:47 a.m. in the emergency room of Chicago General Hospital, 3 pounds and 2 ounces of fierce determination wrapped in translucent skin that showed the delicate network of veins carrying life through her tiny body. Despite her premature arrival and the traumatic circumstances of her birth, she emerged with clear lungs and strong reflexes, her first cry echoing through the delivery room like a declaration that she intended to survive whatever challenges the world presented. Emily held her daughter for exactly 90 seconds before the NICU team whisked Grace away to an incubator where machines would provide the support her underdeveloped organs still needed. Those 90 seconds felt simultaneously eternal and impossibly brief, long enough for Emily to memorize every detail of Grace's perfect miniature features, but not nearly enough time to communicate the fierce love that had sustained her through months of abandonment and despair. "She's a fighter," Dr. Sarah Kim told Emily, as the medical team worked to stabilize Grace's breathing and temperature. "Premature babies born under stress often show remarkable resilience. Her vital signs are stronger than we typically see at 34 weeks. Emily lay in the hospital bed, her body exhausted from labor, but her mind crystalline with newfound clarity. Watching her daughter fight for each breath in the NICU had burned away the last vestiges of the woman who'd begged strangers for basic human consideration. In her place was someone who understood that survival required self-reliance, that love meant protection, and that her daughter's future depended entirely on Emily's ability to create stability from nothing. The hospital's social worker arrived the next morning, a tired-looking woman named Angela Reyes, who carried a clipboard thick with forms designed to document Emily's inadequacy as a parent. Angela's questions focused on housing, income, support systems, all the things Emily lacked, with the underlying assumption that premature birth combined with homelessness represented evidence of maternal failure requiring institutional intervention. "The state has protocols for ensuring infant welfare when parents can't provide appropriate care," Angela explained, with the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered this speech countless times. "Temporary custody arrangements can give you time to establish housing and employment while ensuring your daughter receives proper care." Emily stared at the social worker, understanding that she was being offered the chance to surrender her child to a system that would provide everything Emily couldn't: stability, resources, professional caregivers who weren't homeless teenagers sleeping in doorways. The reasonable choice, the choice that prioritized Grace's welfare over Emily's maternal desires, would be to sign papers that transferred custody to people better equipped to provide for a premature infant's complex needs. "No," Emily said, the word emerging with quiet force that surprised even her. "My daughter stays with me." Angela's pen paused over her clipboard. "Ms. Rodriguez, I understand maternal attachment is strong, but we need to consider what's best for the baby. Premature infants require consistent medical care, proper nutrition, stable housing." "Then I'll provide those things," Emily interrupted, her voice carrying a certainty she didn't entirely feel but refused to let waver. "Whatever my daughter needs, I'll make sure she gets it." "With what resources?" Angela asked, her tone shifting to the practiced patience of someone accustomed to dealing with delusional parents. "You have no income, no housing, no family support. How exactly do you plan to care for a premature infant under those circumstances?" Emily looked through the NICU window at Grace's tiny form connected to monitors and feeding tubes, her daughter's chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance that emphasized her vulnerability. But she also saw Grace's fingers opening and closing with purposeful movement, her eyes tracking toward sounds and light, with alert intelligence that suggested a spirit too strong to be defeated by difficult beginnings. "I don't know yet," Emily admitted, "but I'll figure it out. That's what mothers do." Angela made notes that Emily couldn't read but suspected weren't favorable. "The hospital can only keep you for 72 hours after delivery. If you don't have appropriate housing arranged by discharge, we'll have to initiate emergency custody procedures." 72 hours. Emily had 3 days to transform her circumstances from homeless desperation to stable parenthood, to create the foundation for a life that could support her daughter's needs and prove to officials that maternal love could overcome systemic obstacles designed to separate poor mothers from their children. That afternoon, while Grace slept in her incubator and Emily struggled with the physical recovery from giving birth on a sidewalk, an unexpected visitor appeared in her hospital room doorway. Maria Santos was a small woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair and calloused hands that spoke of decades spent in manual labor, but her eyes held a warmth that Emily hadn't seen directed at her in months. "Excuse me, dear," Maria said, speaking with a slight accent that suggested English was her second language. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm Maria Santos. I clean the NICU at night, and I couldn't help but notice your beautiful daughter." Emily tensed, expecting another lecture about her inadequacy as a parent or another offer of help that came with conditions designed to humiliate rather than heal. But Maria simply pulled up a chair and sat down, with the unhurried manner of someone who had time for genuine conversation. "She has your eyes," Maria continued, glancing toward the NICU window where Grace was visible among the other premature infants fighting for life with technological assistance. "And your determination. I've been working here for 15 years, and I can always tell which babies have that extra spark that helps them overcome difficult beginnings. You think she'll be okay? Emily asked, surprised by how desperately she wanted reassurance from this stranger who spent her nights caring for the hospital's most vulnerable patients. I think she has a mother who loves her enough to give birth on a sidewalk, rather than surrendering to people who told her she didn't deserve help, Maria said with quiet conviction. That kind of love creates miracles more powerful than any machine in this hospital. Emily felt tears threatening for the first time since Grace's birth, but these weren't tears of despair or humiliation. They were tears of recognition. Someone finally saw her maternal devotion as strength rather than delusion, her fierce protectiveness as an asset rather than a problem requiring management. The social worker says I need housing and income to keep her, Emily said, testing whether Maria's kindness would evaporate when confronted with practical realities. She says the state will take custody if I can't provide appropriate care. Maria's expression hardened, with an anger that transformed her gentle features into something formidable. The state thinks children are better off in foster care than with mothers who love them but happen to be poor. I've seen what happens to babies who get separated from their families because the mothers couldn't afford the kind of life officials thought they deserved. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to the conspiratorial tone of someone sharing privileged information. But I also know something about surviving when systems are designed to defeat you. I came to this country with nothing, raised 4 children while working 3 jobs, sent them all to college despite people who told me poor immigrant women couldn't provide the kind of life American children needed. How? Emily asked, feeling hope stirring in her chest like Grace's first movements in the womb. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one person willing to help at a time, Maria said, echoing words Emily had heard before but with a sincerity that made them feel true rather than patronizing. And sometimes, when you've proven that love matters more than money, opportunities appear that you never expected. Maria reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been carried around for days. My daughter Rosa manages a residential facility for women transitioning out of crisis situations. It's not charity. Residents work to earn their housing and support each other while building independent lives. Rosa has been looking for someone to help with administrative work, someone who understands what it's like to be judged by circumstances rather than character. Emily took the paper with trembling hands, reading an address for New Horizons Transitional Housing, along with a phone number, and Rosa Santos Martinez listed as program director. Why are you helping me? You don't even know me. I know enough, Maria said, standing up with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned to recognize strength in unlikely places. I know you chose to give birth rather than disappear when people made it clear you weren't wanted. I know you're here fighting for your daughter, instead of accepting the easy solution of letting someone else raise her. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. As Maria prepared to leave, she paused at the doorway for one final piece of advice. When you call Rosa, don't apologize for your circumstances or promise to be grateful for any help you receive. Tell her you're a mother who needs an opportunity to prove that determination matters more than privilege. She'll understand. She was born in that NICU 35 years ago when I was in circumstances very similar to yours. That evening, as Emily watched Grace sleep in her mechanical cocoon while monitors tracked every heartbeat and breath, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. Not because someone had rescued her, but because someone had recognized her strength and offered her a chance to rescue herself. She pulled out Maria's daughter's phone number and began composing the conversation that would either open doors or confirm that even the kindest gestures came with limitations she couldn't meet. But for the first time since her world had collapsed, Emily felt ready to advocate for herself and her daughter, with the fierce determination of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Grace stirred in her incubator, her tiny fist clenching and unclenching with the rhythmic determination of someone already learning to fight for what she needed. Emily pressed her hand against the clear plastic that separated them and whispered, "We're going to be okay, baby girl. Your mama's going to make sure of that." The words felt like a promise she finally had the strength to keep. 6 months later, Emily Rodriguez stood in the administrative office of New Horizons Transitional Housing, reviewing intake files for women whose stories echoed her own journey from despair to determination. The office was small but efficiently organized, with filing cabinets that held the documentation of dozens of women who'd discovered that rock bottom could become the foundation for rebuilding their lives with greater strength than they'd ever imagined possible. Grace sat in a portable crib nearby, now 8 months old and thriving with the robust health of a baby, who'd overcome her premature beginning through sheer determination and the devotion of a mother who'd refused to accept defeat. Her dark eyes tracked Emily's movements with alert intelligence, and her chubby hands reached for everything within grasp with the confident curiosity of a child who'd never known anything but love and security. "The new resident arriving today sounds like she's been through hell," Rosa Santos Martinez said, settling into the chair across from Emily's desk with the comfortable familiarity of a boss who'd become a mentor and friend. Rosa was a woman in her 30s, with her mother's warm eyes and the confident bearing of someone who'd transformed her own difficult beginning into a career helping others navigate similar challenges. Emily nodded, reading through the case file of Jennifer Walsh, a 28-year-old woman who'd fled an abusive marriage with her 2 young children and nothing else. The familiar pattern of abandonment and institutional failure echoed through the documentation: family members who'd chosen not to get involved, shelters with waiting lists that stretched beyond immediate need, social workers who'd focused on Jennifer's poor choices rather than her desperate circumstances. "She reminds me of someone I used to know," Emily said with a slight smile that acknowledged how completely her life had transformed since those desperate nights sleeping in parks and doorways. Someone who thought the world had forgotten her completely. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. Emily's first weeks at New Horizons had been filled with the constant anxiety of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to discover she didn't deserve the opportunity she'd been given. The transitional housing facility operated on principles that seemed too good to be true. Residents earned their housing through work contributions rather than charity, built skills through education and job training rather than judgment, and supported each other through shared experience rather than competition for limited resources. Emily had started in the program's childcare center, helping other mothers balance work responsibilities with parenting demands, while Grace received the socialization and developmental support that prepared her for healthy growth. The work felt natural to Emily, whose instinct for nurturing had been suppressed during months of survival mode, but quickly resurged when she found herself in an environment that valued caregiving as legitimate labor rather than evidence of professional limitation. "You have a gift for making people feel seen," Rosa had told Emily after her first month in the program. "The other mothers trust you because they recognize someone who's been where they are. That kind of understanding can't be taught. It has to be earned through experience." Within 3 months, Emily had been promoted to administrative assistant, helping Rosa manage the complex documentation and coordination required to operate a program that served women transitioning from crisis to stability. The work required attention to detail, empathy for individual circumstances, and the ability to navigate bureaucratic systems that often seemed designed to create obstacles rather than opportunities. Emily discovered she had a talent for translating between the language of desperate women and the requirements of funding agencies, helping residents present their circumstances in ways that maximized their access to available resources while maintaining their dignity throughout the process. She could read between the lines of official forms to understand what information was actually being requested, and she could help women frame their experiences in terms that satisfied bureaucratic requirements without requiring them to accept blame for their victimization. "You should consider going back to school," Rosa had suggested during Emily's performance review at the 4-month mark. "The program has partnerships with local colleges that provide tuition assistance for residents who want to pursue degrees in social work or related fields. You have the natural abilities and the lived experience that could make you incredibly effective in this field." The idea of college had seemed impossibly ambitious when Emily was sleeping on park benches, but with stable housing and childcare support, it began to feel like an achievable goal rather than an impossible fantasy. The local community college offered evening classes that accommodated working mothers, and the program's educational support included tutoring and study groups that helped women navigate academic challenges while managing family responsibilities. Emily enrolled in courses that fall, starting with basic requirements that she approached with the focused determination of someone who understood that education represented freedom from the kind of vulnerability she'd experienced during her lowest moments. Grace accompanied her to study sessions, playing quietly while Emily absorbed information about sociology, psychology, and social service administration that helped her understand the systems she'd encountered during her crisis. Her professors were initially skeptical of a young mother whose academic preparation came from public libraries rather than traditional educational settings, but Emily's combination of natural intelligence and hard-earned wisdom quickly distinguished her from students who'd never experienced the realities their textbooks described in theoretical terms. "Your insights into poverty and homelessness are particularly valuable," Professor Amanda Chen told Emily after she'd submitted a paper analyzing the barriers that prevent homeless women from accessing available services. "You write about these issues with an understanding that comes from lived experience rather than academic study. That perspective is crucial for anyone who wants to work effectively in social services." The paper had been based on Emily's own journey through the maze of programs and agencies that claim to help women in crisis while actually creating additional obstacles through their requirements and conditions. She documented the psychological impact of systems that required people to accept blame for their circumstances as the price of receiving assistance, and she proposed reforms that would focus on empowerment rather than rehabilitation. "The current approach treats poverty as a character defect rather than a systemic failure," Emily had written. "Women are required to participate in counseling that addresses their poor choices rather than receiving support that helps them navigate limited options created by economic inequality and social prejudice." Her professors encouraged her to present the paper at a regional conference on social service reform, where her recommendations attracted attention from policy researchers who'd been studying the same issues from academic perspectives without the benefit of first-hand experience. Now, as Emily prepared to welcome Jennifer Walsh into the program that had transformed her own life, she reflected on how completely her circumstances had changed while her core values had remained constant. She was still the same person who'd volunteered at community centers and helped elderly neighbors with their shopping, but now she had the skills and resources to make her natural compassion more effective. Grace babbled contentedly from her crib, reaching for a stuffed animal that one of the other residents had made for her in the program's craft workshop. The baby, who'd been born on a sidewalk to a mother with nowhere to go, was now surrounded by a community of women who looked out for each other's children as extensions of their own families. "Mama," Grace said suddenly, her first clear word emerging with perfect timing as Emily finished reviewing Jennifer's file. The sound filled Emily with the same fierce joy she'd felt during those 90 seconds in the delivery room, but now it was tempered with the confidence of someone who knew she could provide the security and love her daughter deserved. Rosa smiled at the milestone moment. She's going to grow up thinking this is how the world works, surrounded by strong women who support each other and create opportunities rather than waiting for rescue from people who may never come. Emily nodded, understanding that Grace's childhood would be fundamentally different from her own, not because they had more money or lived in a better neighborhood, but because they were part of a community that valued resilience over privilege, mutual support over individual achievement, and authentic care over conditional charity. The phone rang, and Emily answered with the professional confidence she'd developed through months of practice. "New Horizons Transitional Housing. This is Emily Rodriguez speaking." The voice on the other end was small and frightened, but determined. "This is Jennifer Walsh. I was told to call about housing for my children and me. We need somewhere safe to stay." "Jennifer, we've been expecting your call," Emily said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who remembered exactly how frightening it felt to ask strangers for help that might come with conditions you couldn't meet. "I have your information right here, and I want you to know that you're going to be okay. We're going to help you figure this out, one step at a time." As she began explaining the program's approach to Jennifer, Emily caught sight of her reflection in the office window, a professional woman in clean clothes, sitting at her own desk, speaking with authority about resources and opportunities rather than begging for scraps of assistance. The transformation was so complete that sometimes she had to remind herself that the confident social worker speaking was the same person who'd given birth on a sidewalk just months earlier. But she never forgot that experience, because it had taught her the most important lesson of her life. When the world tells you that you don't matter, the only choice that matters is refusing to believe them. Everything else, the housing, the education, the career, the community, had grown from that single moment of deciding that she and her daughter deserved better than whatever crumbs others were willing to offer. Grace reached for her mother's hand, and Emily squeezed her daughter's tiny fingers, while continuing to explain to Jennifer how New Horizons worked to help women transform crisis into opportunity. Through the window, she could see Chicago's skyline gleaming in the afternoon sun, the same view she'd seen from Lincoln Park during those desperate nights when survival had seemed impossible. Now that view represented possibility rather than exclusion, a reminder of how far she'd traveled and how much further she planned to go. 2 years later, Emily Rodriguez Santos stood at a podium in the ballroom of Chicago's Palmer House Hotel, looking out at an audience of social workers, policymakers, and community leaders who had gathered for the annual conference on innovative approaches to homelessness prevention. The same woman who had once been invisible to people in expensive suits was now being introduced as the keynote speaker, someone whose insights had influenced state-level policy changes and whose program had become a model for communities across the Midwest. Grace, now 2.5, sat in the front row with Rosa and Maria Santos, her tiny hands clapping enthusiastically at the sight of her mother taking the stage. She was a beautiful child, with Emily's determined eyes and a smile that could melt the hardest hearts, dressed in a small navy dress that Maria had sewn for this special occasion. 3 years ago, Emily began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone to reach every corner of the elegant ballroom, I was sleeping on a park bench in December, while 7 months pregnant, invisible to everyone who passed by except the security guards who wanted me moved along. Tonight, I stand before you not as someone who was rescued from that situation, but as someone who learned that the greatest transformation happens when we stop waiting for others to save us and start building the lives we deserve. The audience listened with the respectful attention given to distinguished speakers, but Emily knew that many of them had no real understanding of the desperation that drove someone to give birth on a sidewalk. They were good people who genuinely wanted to help, but their help often came with conditions that revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of how poverty and homelessness actually worked. When well-meaning people offered me assistance during my crisis, Emily continued, it usually came with requirements that I accept responsibility for my circumstances, that I demonstrate gratitude for their charity, and that I participate in programs designed to fix whatever character defects had led to my situation. The underlying assumption was that homelessness and poverty were symptoms of personal failure rather than systemic dysfunction. She paused, allowing her words to settle over an audience that included many people who designed and funded exactly the kinds of programs she was critiquing. But Emily had learned that real change required uncomfortable conversations, that challenging assumptions was more valuable than polite acceptance of inadequate solutions. The New Horizons model works because it starts from a different premise, Emily explained, her confidence growing as she moved into territory where her expertise was unquestionable. We assume that women in crisis are intelligent, capable individuals who need opportunities rather than rehabilitation. We provide housing, education, and job training not as charity, but as investments in human potential that benefit entire communities. In the audience, she spotted a familiar face that made her heart skip slightly. James Walker sat near the back, older and somehow smaller than she remembered, his expensive suit unable to disguise the discomfort in his expression as he listened to her speak. Beside him sat Catherine, her face showing the careful blankness of someone who'd been dragged to an event she'd rather avoid. Emily felt a moment of satisfaction at their presence, knowing they'd come because James served on the board of a foundation that was considering funding the New Horizons expansion. The man who'd once offered her temporary charity was now listening to her explain why his approach had been fundamentally flawed, though she doubted he had the self-awareness to recognize his own behavior in her critique of systemic failures. The most important lesson I learned during my darkest period, Emily continued, was that dignity isn't something others can grant or revoke. It's something we claim for ourselves, regardless of our circumstances. When we design programs that require people to surrender their dignity as the price of receiving help, we create systems that perpetuate the problems they claim to solve. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, showing statistics that demonstrated the New Horizons program's success rates compared to traditional approaches. Women who participated in their empowerment-based model were significantly more likely to achieve long-term stability, pursue education, and avoid returning to crisis situations. These numbers tell a story about human potential, Emily said, her voice warming as she moved toward her conclusion. When we treat people experiencing homelessness as temporarily displaced individuals, rather than permanently broken ones, when we provide opportunities rather than just band-aids, when we focus on strengths rather than deficits, amazing things happen. After her presentation, during the networking reception that followed, Emily found herself surrounded by people who wanted to discuss program replication, funding opportunities, and policy implications. The conversations energized her because they represented concrete possibilities for helping more women transform their circumstances through empowerment rather than charity. She was explaining the program's peer mentorship component to a group of foundation executives when James Walker approached, his expression carefully neutral, but his discomfort obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, extending his hand with the practiced courtesy of someone accustomed to social obligations, "congratulations on your success. Your presentation was quite illuminating." Emily shook his hand with the calm confidence of someone who no longer needed anything from him. "Thank you, Mr. Walker. I hope you found it useful for your foundation's work." "I was wondering," James continued, his voice carrying the cautious tone of someone testing dangerous waters, "if you might have time to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. The Walker Foundation is always looking for innovative programs to support." Emily studied his face, seeing the calculation behind his offer. James Walker was still collecting good deeds, still looking for projects that would make him feel valuable and generous. But now she was on the other side of the equation, someone with resources and expertise rather than desperation and need. "I'd be happy to have someone from our development team send you information about our expansion plans," Emily said politely. "Rosa Santos Martinez, our director, handles most of our foundation relationships. I'm sure she'd be delighted to discuss how your organization might support our work." The subtle rejection, professional but firm, clearly surprised James, who'd probably expected her to be grateful for his attention. But Emily was no longer the woman who begged for help from people who viewed her desperation as entertainment. She was now someone who evaluated potential partners based on their alignment with her program's values rather than their ability to provide resources she couldn't access elsewhere. As the reception wound down and Emily prepared to leave with Grace and the Santos family, she reflected on how completely her relationship with the world had transformed. 3 years earlier, she'd been invisible to people who mattered, her existence noticed only when it inconvenienced others. Now she was someone whose opinions influenced policy, whose program was studied by researchers, whose story inspired other women to believe that their circumstances could change. But the most profound transformation wasn't professional. It was personal. Emily had learned to see herself as worthy of respect and consideration, not because of her achievements, but because of her inherent human dignity. The woman who'd once apologized for existing now spoke with authority about social justice and systemic change. Grace fell asleep in her car seat on the drive home to the apartment Emily had been able to afford once her salary increased and her student loans for her now completed bachelor's degree became manageable. It was a modest 2-bedroom place in a safe neighborhood, nothing fancy but clean and comfortable, with a small garden where Grace could play and Emily could grow the flowers that reminded her beauty was possible even in difficult circumstances. As Emily carried her sleeping daughter upstairs, she thought about the letter she'd received that morning from her parents, the first contact they'd attempted since throwing her out 3 years earlier. Carlos was in remission from his heart problems, and Isabel had written to express their desire to meet their granddaughter and apologize for their reaction to Emily's pregnancy. "We were wrong," the letter had said in her mother's careful handwriting. "We let fear and pride make us cruel when you needed us most. We know we don't deserve forgiveness, but we hope you might allow us to be part of Grace's life, to try to make amends for the pain we caused." Emily hadn't decided how to respond. Part of her wanted to share Grace's joy and achievements with the grandparents who'd missed her first steps, first words, and first birthday. But another part of her remembered the crushing rejection when she'd needed them most, the way they'd prioritized their reputation over their daughter's welfare. "What do you think, baby girl?" Emily whispered as she tucked Grace into her toddler bed, surrounded by stuffed animals and picture books. "Should we give them a chance to be the grandparents you deserve?" Grace stirred slightly, mumbling something that sounded like "mama" before settling deeper into sleep. Whatever Emily decided about her parents, she knew it would be based on what was best for Grace, rather than what might heal Emily's own wounds. That was the difference between charity and love. Real love prioritized the other person's welfare over your own emotional needs. Emily walked to her living room window and looked out at the city lights that twinkled like earthbound stars across Chicago's skyline. Somewhere out there, women were sleeping in parks and doorways wondering if tomorrow would bring relief or more rejection. Somewhere, pregnant women were discovering that the people they'd trusted most were unwilling to help when help required sacrifice rather than just sentiment. But also somewhere out there, women were finding their strength, refusing to accept defeat, building lives from determination and hope rather than waiting for rescue from others. Emily's story wasn't unique. It was one thread in a larger tapestry of resilience that connected every woman who'd ever had to choose between dignity and desperation. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Rosa. "Amazing presentation tonight. The foundation interest is incredible. We might be able to open 3 new sites next year." Emily smiled, thinking about the women who would benefit from those expanded opportunities, the children who would grow up with mothers empowered rather than dependent, the communities that would be strengthened by programs that invested in human potential rather than managing human problems. 3 years ago, she said aloud to the empty room, I thought my life ended on that park bench, but that bench was just the beginning. Because sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing you build. Sometimes losing everything teaches you that you already had everything you needed inside yourself. And sometimes the people who abandon you in your darkest hour aren't the ones who matter. The ones who matter are the ones who see your light even when you can't see it yourself. Emily's story had become proof that dignity wasn't something others could grant or revoke, that strength could grow from the most broken places, and that love, real love, was powerful enough to transform despair into hope, isolation into community, and individual survival into collective transformation. Have you ever experienced something similar? Or do you know someone who has faced circumstances that seemed impossible to overcome? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps us spread this message of hope and resilience to others who might need to hear it. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.